This podcast is brought to you by Church Society, a fellowship contending to reform and renew the Church of England in biblical faith. You'll find more information about Church Society and all the things that we do on our website, churchsociety.org. You'll also find there the full archive of the podcast.
Welcome back to the Church Society podcast. I'm Lee Gatiss, the director of Church Society. I'm also the series editor of a new Bible commentary series, the Hodder Bible Commentary. And this podcast is part of a series of interviews with the authors of the Hodder Bible Commentaries about their work. We hope that this will build into a great resource on the podcast with introductions and overviews of every book of the Bible, which will be a great help to preachers and Bible study leaders everywhere. Building on the success of Hodder's NIV Proclamation Bible, we've assembled contributors, a remarkable team of them, of men and women from around the world, alongside a diverse panel of trusted consultant editors. They have a tremendous variety of denominational backgrounds and ministries. Each of the authors has great experience in unfolding the gospel of Jesus Christ, and all are united in our aim of faithfully expounding the Bible in a way that takes account of the original text, biblical theology, the history of interpretation, and the needs of the contemporary global church. So that's just by way of introduction to the series as a whole, and I am joined today by Dr. Graham Beynon, who is head of Local Church Ministries for the Fellowship of Independent Evangelical Churches, FIEC, and he's also a visiting lecturer at Oak Hill Theological College in London. Hello, Graham.
Hi, Lee. Nice to be with you.
Well, you have wonderfully written the Hodder Bible Commentary on the Old Testament book of Joshua. Tell us about how you got interested in Joshua.
Yeah, well, I was looking back, I think it's over 25 years ago, I first preached a short series on Joshua.
Wow.
It's not like it's been a study project for me over all those years, but it was back then that I started. And I ended up developing that when I gave talks, particularly on how the New Testament interprets the Old Testament and how we should therefore interpret the Old Testament and apply it to Jesus and apply it to ourselves today as Christian believers. And I use Joshua as a worked example, various passages from Joshua. And then much later, just a few years ago, actually then preached the entire way through Joshua. Until then, I'd really just done little selections.
So you went through all 24 chapters in a church sermon series.
Yes, we did. And many people will know that the later chapters, the second half of the book, involves dividing the land, and many sermon series speed up at that stage.
Yes.
Our series, I'd like to think we kind of took a bold choice, and we didn't speed up too much. So we didn't just do all the inheritance of the land in one go or anything like that, or even in a couple. We did it piece by piece. And I think discovered good riches in there as a result, which hopefully people will find in the commentary.
Fantastic. So in this beautifully produced 300 or so page hardback commentary, which is coming out in November 2024, you've covered the whole of Joshua from start to finish. Who did you really have in mind when you were writing this?
Yeah, it's really for anybody who wants to study Joshua and think about how it applies to them and to us today. And that could be somebody who just wants to read it privately themselves. It could be somebody leading a Bible study group on it. It could be someone who wants to preach through it. So there's different levels of interaction, but really anyone who wants to read the text of Joshua, consider what it means and consider its themes and application today.
And wrestle with some of its big questions. It's really useful that the text of Joshua in the NIV is included in the commentary itself. So I've got the latest NIV text and the commentary together in one book. But in a big book like Joshua, it's easy to lose sight of the big picture. What is the big picture in Joshua, the melodic line, so to speak, which you really want us to keep hold of throughout the whole book?
Yeah, and Joshua is basically all about the land, the promised land that God had promised Abraham and then Abraham's descendants in turn. It's about getting them into the land and then giving them the land to sort of divide it up between them.
Mm.
So it's kind of a book of two halves, getting into the land in the first case, which involves defeating the inhabitants, the current inhabitants, then dividing the land so it becomes their inheritance, and then finishes with a call to loyalty in living in the land. So that's kind of an appendix at the end. But basically, if God's promise was to get people out of Egypt and into his promised land, this is the capstone. This is the end of that journey. And it finishes with them, well, we're in, we've got it. It's divided up between us. We've been called to live for God here in his place under his rule. And it then sets up really the rest of the Old Testament story.
Can you summarize the whole message in 7 words? Maybe not.
Maybe not. If I thought about it longer, maybe, but yeah.
Who wrote this book, Joshua, and when? When's it come from?
Yeah, well, the simple answer is we don't know who wrote it. We are told in various points during the book that Joshua was told to write certain things down. And so it's very likely there are some recorded elements from him. We get comments about how Joshua, how some of the events, like setting up a stone or something like that, persist to this day, or that someone's family lives amongst the Israelites to this day, and that is the day of writing. It depends quite how literally you understand it. Is that said of Rahab and her family? Does that mean it was written within the lifetime of Rahab, or are her descendants still alive? And that would be a perfectly reasonable interpretation as well.
Right.
So we don't know exactly who wrote it. We do know there were probably some recorded elements, and I would certainly think it was written relatively recently after the events. That's contested. A lot of scholarship would say it was written quite a lot later in Israel's history.
But there's clearly some written sources that it's drawing on from earlier, even if it is compiled and edited together later, maybe in the time of King David or something like that.
Yeah.
Interesting. So what are some of the major themes in Joshua for us as Christians to be interested in? What am I going to get out of a sermon series? What are the themes that my congregation are going to learn, or I'm going to learn if I'm doing this in my quiet times?
Yeah, a whole variety. It's a very rich book. I think God's faithfulness has to be kind of probably top of the list, in that getting them into the land and dividing the land up and sort of giving it to them as their inheritance. We're told at the end that God kind of kept all his promises. There's a verse actually on the back of the commentary: not one of all the Lord's good promises to Israel failed, every one was fulfilled. That's from chapter 21. That finishes those first 2 main sections I spoke about. It actually comes from several verses which emphasize how God did absolutely everything he promised.
So that could be like a key verse. We could summarize it as God keeps his promises.
God keeps his promises. That's right. God's faithfulness. God keeps all his promises. Now, there's much, much more to that. Like, how then do the people respond to God and trust him for his promises, or in some cases not trust him for his promises? That's a really key theme. That comes back to stuff about the covenant relationship between God and his people, and how that works. There's stuff about exactly how he gets them into the land, that it's a gracious gift. They do nothing to get it, and that, I think, looks forward to the graciousness of salvation in Christ. So big theme, God's faithfulness, lots of richness and detail that kind of comes underneath that.
And you said covenant. That's obviously a very important Old Testament word. Just tell us briefly what you mean by that.
Yeah, I mean, a covenant is basically the shape of a relationship. If I say, here's how we're going to live together, here's the deal, you do this, I do that, it gives a shape to the relationship. We'll be familiar with marriage covenants today. I'm going to love you, you're going to love me, no matter how well I am or nice I am to you. That's a shape to the relationship. So God's covenant gives a certain shape. And we see the covenant, particularly the covenant with Moses, being enacted within Joshua. So the background of Joshua is Deuteronomy in particular, earlier books as well, promises to Abraham, but Deuteronomy in particular sets up how the relationship ought to work. And we see a lot of that worked out in practice in the book of Joshua.
Very helpful. Thank you. Joshua's a great story. I mean, there's some wonderful episodes in this book. It's inspiring and it's encouraging to read. But are there particular issues that we need to be aware of when we're studying narrative parts of the Bible like this? I mean, especially perhaps when it comes to killing Canaanites. And there's a lot of killing Canaanites in this book.
Yeah. Well, let me just say two things. I'll come to the Canaanites in a second, but
Okay.
I mean, first we should be thoughtful in how we read any book of the Bible, but in particularly narratives, and particularly what you might think of as successful narratives. So you may know that Joshua is a key text, for example, for the prosperity gospel people, because they say, trust and obey God like Joshua did, and he'll make you prosperous and successful wherever you go.
Yeah.
And so a key thing to be aware of within the excitement of the story is, who do we identify with? Am I Joshua? Am I one of the people of Israel? And so on. So that's one thing to say we need to be cautious about. The second thing are some particular themes to Joshua, and the killing of the Canaanites, the original inhabitants of the land, would be the really big one. And understandably, people feel nervous about that, embarrassed about that, maybe. Accusations of genocide are made.
Yes.
And some people end up playing down what's in the text, or maybe even changing what they think what seems to be in the text. I think while it is a very sobering thing, I think it's a really key thing to take as written and take seriously, and use our understanding of biblical theology. What is happening in Joshua is God's kingdom is coming in a particular area of the world. God will rule in Canaan. And when his kingdom comes and he rules, there will be no opposition to it. Opposition will be punished. Now, people actually had the option of joining the Israelites to it. Someone like Rahab's a good example of that. The
Right.
Gibeonites later are an example of that. It's not that God just wanted to kill everybody. God wanted people to bow the knee to him. But if they wouldn't, then they would be punished. And that actually is a very sobering picture of the return of Jesus, when he brings his kingdom not just to one geographical area, but to the whole world. And where every knee will bow to him, and rebellion against him will be punished.
Were they poor innocent Canaanites being punished by God? This is a horrible, nasty God we're coming up against here?
No, not at all, because there'd be two things on that. One would be our general understanding of humanity. Our doctrine of sin would tell us they're not simply innocent. But more specifically, back in Genesis 15, we're told that the entry into the land will be delayed until the sin of the inhabitants has reached full measure, is the phrase. So it's like, I'm waiting until their sin deserves this. And when we know about them and know some of their practices, we do know they were a very unpleasant group. I mean, they sacrificed their children to their idols. This is not the killing of an innocent group who've done nothing.
Right.
It is people who fundamentally have rejected God, as we all have, but have also worked that out in particularly horrible ways in their lives.
Now more than ever, Christians in the Church of England need to be contending for the true faith against false teaching in the church. That's why we've republished our book Fight Valiantly in a new, revised and expanded edition to enable all Christians to understand how they can play their part in contending for gospel faith. In this book, Lee Gatiss examines the biblical material on this neglected subject and also helps us to consider some of the applications in the Church of England today, especially in the light of the ongoing living in love and faith process. There are many stories of people contending for the faith in different ways, including within the living in love and faith process. There's also a Bible study guide suitable for use by individuals or groups that would be ideal to work together with your PCC or church leadership team. Fight Valiantly, the new, revised and expanded edition, is now available from Church Society.
So just to go back that other issue you talked about, the prosperity gospel, and am I Joshua in the story, and will I be able to trust God's promises and he'll give me the land? Whatever the land is in my life, God will give it to me if I just have enough faith.
Yeah.
Tell me, I mean, isn't that what Joshua's saying? No.
No, I don't think so.
Why not? Why not? Why is that a misuse of this text?
Well, I think even there's a whole number of ways of approaching that, but just say takes those promises come in chapter 1. Just take how chapter 1 works. God speaks to Joshua individually, singular, you, Joshua. You must obey the book of the law. You must trust me. And if you do, I will be with you like I was with Moses. And I will make you prosperous and successful. In what way? In entering the land as I have promised.
Right.
And then the people of Israel are told to get ready to go, etc. By the end of chapter 1, they have said, we will obey you, Joshua, just like we obeyed Moses. Only may God be with you so that you'll be successful. In other words, the important thing is that you obey and that God's with you, and we ride on the back of that. And so we're following you. So even in chapter 1, you kind of go, well, who do I identify with? I identify with the people who want to follow God's anointed leader. And if the leader is obedient, then the plans will work. So even there, I think, and so then that would obviously today, that would point us forward to the Lord Jesus, who is God's anointed leader, who both brings God's kingdom and makes the way for us to enter the kingdom. And the key thing is we see him as God's leader and we then bow to him and follow him. But he's the one who has to be obedient, and he's the one who is prosperous and successful.
So there's no direct application to the head of local ministries of FIEC or the director of Church Society as such. It's not about following that anointed ruler or something like that.
No, not at all. I think there would be secondary applications to, well, what do you look for in a leader today?
Okay.
You look for somebody who trusts God's law. You look for someone who doesn't turn to it from the right or to the left, who sets a good example, and so on. So there are going to be secondary applications like that. But in the first instance, it's about Jesus, and certainly the promises of success and prosperity, everything in your hand prospering, that applies to this particular appointed leader in entering the land, and then to Jesus.
Because Christ is the anointed king. I mean, Christ means
Exactly.
anointed one. So yeah, so that's really helpful. There must be other places in the book where we can learn doctrine from Joshua. Tell us about some of the interesting doctrinal contributions that Joshua makes that we wouldn't get perhaps if Joshua wasn't in the canon.
Yeah, I don't think it's not a book that's kind of like a key textbook for certain doctrines, but I think you come across a whole variety of doctrines that you might not be expecting in kind of battle narrative and dividing the land. We've mentioned one already, actually, punishment of sin would be one key element. I think the unity of God's people runs through the book. I hadn't seen that as much myself until I started to preach through it and then write on it. And then a whole variety of smaller things. The cities of refuge in chapter 20, for example.
Yes.
God's concern for justice, and behind that is the sanctity of life, for example. And if I was preaching on that passage today, I think, obviously understand it in its context first and so on, but I don't think it would be unreasonable to go on and make reference to assisted suicide or something, because behind it is the view of sanctity of life. So there's a whole variety of doctrines that we would find elsewhere, but which are either illustrated or taught in certain ways in Joshua that I certainly wasn't expecting.
It's interesting how narrative often illustrates doctrines rather than teaching them directly like that.
Yeah.
You might get the direct teaching in the book of the law in Exodus or Deuteronomy,
right.
but then you get it illustrated throughout the way God deals with people.
Yeah, exactly.
Were there any particularly interesting details in the book that you were excited by as you were writing? You've already mentioned some things that you perhaps hadn't seen when you'd preached on it or used it before in teaching. Are there other things where you thought, wow, I've not seen this before, or that you got very carried away with when you were researching, digging into it? Did you go down any interesting rabbit holes, for example?
Well, I mean, the whole second half on the dividing up the land as the inheritance is obviously harder work, because a lot of it describes things like boundary lines.
Yes.
And we have to be honest about that. But I discovered both much more about how that whole section is structured, and therefore what's happening in it. For example, beginning with Caleb. So
Yes.
he acts almost as a model of, here's how a faithful Israelite would inherit the land. He, of course, he and Joshua were the ones who thought they could inherit the land first time around back in Numbers.
Yes.
And he cites that and basically says, I believe the same thing today. I can go in and do it because God's with me, and so on.
And that's why we always say that Joshua, son of Nun, and Caleb, son of Jephunneh, were the only ones who saw the land of milk and honey.
Yeah. Well, some people say that, Lee, but and actually, interestingly, that whole division of the land section begins then with Caleb, and it finishes with Joshua. So it's bracketed by these two faithful Israelites. I think there's a lot going on there that I hadn't seen before. And then on occasion, just little details in the text. I mean, right at the end of the book, we're told about the burial of the bones of Joseph.
Yes.
For example. And you thought, what? Yeah, well, what? Why? And I think there's several things going on. I think actually it means the end of Joshua is the final end of the Exodus, because Joseph looked forward to coming up out of Egypt and going to the land, and now finally he's buried in the land. So it's the end of that great journey and the start of life in the land, as I mentioned earlier.
It all goes back to Genesis there, doesn't it? Because Joseph's a main character, the last section of Genesis. And so
that's right.
That sort of concluded at the end of Joshua is a wonderful climax to that.
Yeah, it really is. It really is. I mean, it's just like we buried his bones. It's like, no, it's like we buried his bones. This is a climax moment. But also, Joseph then is also a paradigm example. He believed God's promises. He believed they're getting to the land. He trusted God for it. He looked ahead to it. And as the book of Joshua finishes, it actually finishes, I think, in a slightly kind of poignant, kind of questioning way. They're in the land now. Will they continue to trust God and rely on him like people like Joseph did? And so, yeah, just seeing details in little passages like that I hadn't seen before.
And there's application there for us too, isn't there? I mean, we have salvation in Christ. Are we going to be faithful now? So it's questioning us. It's leaving it open for us to have our own response of faith and trusting God's promises going forward as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. There's a lot of both picture of God and what he's like and what he does for his faithfulness, but a lot of our heart response to him. Do we look to him, trust him, rely on him? There's a lot of that going on in Joshua.
But I'm not being called to go and kill any Canaanites as part of that, am I?
Not this week, Lee, no. Okay,
well, that's good to know. Thank you. You write really well in the commentary, and really clearly for a general audience. It's for all adult readers, not just for big brain scholars like you. But when it's important, you've engaged in the footnotes with modern scholarship and some of the questions it's thrown up about the text, which is really helpful. But you also seem to have read much more widely than that. So tell us about your use of some of the African and other global voices in commentaries in here, and your engagement with comments from other people in church history as well in the commentary.
Yeah, I really enjoyed that. I both engaged with a lot of modern commentaries, but I also looked at the, as you mentioned, the African Bible commentary, East Asian, Eastern European, and others, and a number of ones from church history. And that just gave, I think, a richness and a variety of perspective in different ways. Reading a 19th century woman talking about Rahab, very different perspective to mine today, very helpful. Reading someone from East Asia talk about dividing up the land
Yes.
and how land rights were a contested issue in their context. Well, actually, I don't think Joshua necessarily speaks to that directly, but land rights aren't an issue for me, and it would never have occurred to me to have raised that as a topic. But I mention it in passing in the commentary.
So it helps you see things that are in the text, but you wouldn't see because of your own cultural location, perhaps blinders as well that you have
Yeah.
on. So
Yeah.
it does help by reading those other people, because the word of God didn't originate with you and you're not the only one it's reached.
Absolutely, absolutely. There are two ways of stepping out of our own kind of viewpoints and situation, and one is to go elsewhere in the world, and the other is to go elsewhere in time. And both of those help us either ask different questions or give answers to questions that we wouldn't have thought of, or raise topics that we wouldn't have raised. And that's really helpful. I hope some of that will enrich the commentary.
Yeah, it certainly does. Of course, in many of our cities today as well, they're a multicultural melting pot. And so being able to see things from different perspectives and apply things in different perspectives like that could be really helpful in some urban ministries, particularly.
Yeah, I really hope so. And that's exactly the context many people will be ministering in today.
Yeah, that's terrific. So the Hodder Bible Commentary on the book of Joshua will be out in all good bookshops in November 2024 by Graham Beynon. And as it says on the back of the book of Joshua records the fulfillment of God's promises to his people Israel and points to how he does the same for us in Jesus. Graham Beynon opens up the story of Joshua and shows how it applies to Christian believers today, drawing on modern, historical, and global perspectives. We see how God brings his kingdom through Jesus and what it means for us to enter the kingdom and to live in it now. Thanks for joining us, Graham. I hope this commentary will be widely read and enjoyed by many people.
Thanks very much. Pleasure.
Thank you so much for listening to this episode of the Church Society podcast. You can find the whole podcast archive on our website, churchsociety.org. Don't forget to subscribe to us on your usual podcast app, and we'd love it if you are able to leave a review or give us a rating over there as well.